The mountains swallow them whole in 3 seconds. One moment, Kevin Atkinson and John Adams were exploring a pile of volcanic rocks in southern Oregon. The next, they were buried alive under tons of razor-sharp debris, screaming into darkness that no one could see them escape from. Kevin Smith had that restless energy that seems to infect teenage boys on perfect spring mornings. May 24th, 1987 was one of those days, warm enough to forget it was still technically spring, with the kind of crystalline Oregon sky that makes you want to be anywhere but indoors. His younger brother Mike was already loading gear into their beat-up Jeep when Kevin announced they were taking the long route to Lava Beds National Monument. The Smith brothers weren't your typical weekend warriors. They've been exploring the volcanic underworld around Klamath Falls for over a year now, ever since Kevin had convinced his parents that spelunking was educational. Kevin, 17 and built like a distance runner, had that quiet confidence that comes from knowing your way around dangerous places. Mike, 15 and stockier, was the cautious one, always checking gear twice and remembering to tell someone where they were going. Usually, they'd invited Kevin Atkinson along because he was fearless in that particularly 16-year-old way that makes adults nervous. The fourth member was John Adams, barely 14 and eager to prove he belonged with the older kids. Adams had been begging to join one of their expeditions for months. The drive to Lava Beds took them through countryside that looked like Mars had been dropped into the Oregon High Desert. Volcanic cones rose from sagebrush plains, and everywhere you looked, black rock told the story of a landscape shaped by fire. I've been to Lava Beds, and there's something unsettling about the place, even on a bright morning. The rock formations are beautiful, sure, but they're also alien. Sharp, unforgiving. Everything about the landscape whispers that this isn't a place designed for human comfort. The boys pulled into the Skull Cave parking area around 10 in the morning. Skull Cave is one of the park's main attractions. Massive, accessible, and just scary enough to be thrilling. The entrance yawns open like nature's own cathedral, dropping down into darkness that seems to swallow flashlight beams. But here's where teenage logic kicked in. Why explore the same cave everyone else was touring when you could find your own adventure? Kevin Smith had spotted something on previous trips. A collapse area about a quarter mile off the main trail where the ceiling of an ancient lava tube had given way. Collapse holes are exactly what they sound like, and they're everywhere in lava tube country. When the ceiling of an underground chamber can't support its own weight anymore, it falls in, leaving behind a crater filled with boulder-sized chunks of basalt and obsidian. From above, they look like geological junkyards. Fascinating, mysterious, and completely unstable. The four friends made their way through scrub brush until they reached the spot Kevin had remembered. It was a roughly circular depression, maybe 30 feet across, filled with a chaotic pile of volcanic rock that rose and fell in unpredictable formations. Gaps between the rocks hinted at chambers and passages underneath. The Smith brothers decided to stick with their original plan and explore Skull Cave proper. Kevin Atkinson and John Adams were drawn to the collapse hole, which honestly wasn't surprising. When you're 16 and 14, the idea of crawling into unexplored underground spaces has an almost magnetic appeal. What I find fascinating is how normal it all seemed in the moment. These weren't kids being reckless. They were following the same impulses that have driven exploration for centuries. The only difference is that most explorers don't stumble onto unstable geological formations without realizing it. Atkinson was the first to spot what looked like an entrance. Near the bottom of the rock pile, maybe 15 feet down from the rim, a gap between two large boulders opened into what appeared to be a small chamber. From where he stood, it looked like any other cave entrance. Adam stayed near the top, picking his way carefully between the rocks and peering into the various cracks and crevices. The volcanic glass scattered throughout the debris field caught the morning sun and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Neither of them had any way of knowing that what they were looking at wasn't a stable cave formation at all. It was essentially a house of cards made of rocks, each piece balanced precariously against the others. Atkinson made his way down toward the opening, testing each foothold as he went. What he couldn't see was that his weight was gradually shifting the balance of forces holding the entire pile together. Adams was examining a formation about 10 feet away when he heard what sounded like a small rock fall behind him. He turned to look for Atkinson and saw him disappearing into the opening between the boulders. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then the entire side of the collapse hole simply let go. I've talked to people who've witnessed sudden geological failures, and they all describe the same thing. The sound comes first, a rumbling that you feel in your chest as much as here. Then everything happens at once, too fast for your brain to process. Atkinson had just squeezed through the opening when the rocks above him shifted. The gap he'd entered through disappeared in an instant, sealed by boulders that moments before had been 20 feet away. He found himself in complete darkness, wedged into a space barely large enough for his body. Adams didn't have time to run. The slope he was standing on became a river of volcanic rock, carrying him down into the collapse hole as tons of debris thundered past him. He ended up partially buried about 8 feet down from the original rim, his legs pinned under rocks that would take a team of rescuers with hydraulic equipment to move. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise of the collapse. Adams could hear his own breathing, fast and shallow, and somewhere in the darkness below him, Atkinson calling his name. But the sound was strange, distorted by the maze of rock chambers around them. When the Smith brothers emerged from Skull Cave 45 minutes later, they expected to find their friends waiting by the Jeep. Instead, they found an empty parking area. Then they heard the voices. It took them several minutes to locate the source of the sound. When they finally traced the calls to the collapse hole, the sight that greeted them was sobering. What had been a pile of jumbled but stable-looking rocks was now clearly the site of a major rockfall. Fresh debris was scattered everywhere, and dust still hung in the air. Kevin Smith ran, and I mean ran, like his life depended on it, which in a way it did. The 20-minute sprint to the Indian Wells Visitor Center probably saved both boys' lives. Kevin burst through the visitor center door at 10:20 a.m., gasping out the story to rangers who immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Park Ranger Susan Martinez had been stationed at lava beds for 6 years and had seen her share of cave accidents, but nothing quite like this. Within minutes, the park's emergency protocols kicked into high gear. She radioed for additional support, contacted the sheriff's department, and put in a call to the California Highway Patrol. But she also did something that would prove crucial. She asked if there were any experienced cavers currently in the park. By pure chance, for members of the San Francisco Bay chapter of the National Speleological Society happened to be camping at the park that weekend. Tom Richardson, Janet Liu, Mark Stevens, and David Park were serious spelunkers, the kind of people who actually understand the engineering principles behind cave rescue operations. The thing about cave rescue is that it's equal parts emergency medicine and civil engineering. You're not just trying to get someone out of a hole. You're trying to stabilize a chaotic pile of rock that could shift again at any moment, potentially killing both the victims and the rescuers. The rescue helicopter dispatched from Bieber, California at 10:45 a.m. meant that once the boys were freed, they could be at a hospital within minutes. But helicopter rescues also bring complications. Rotor wash can destabilize loose rock formations. By 11 a.m., the collapse site looked like a small construction zone. Rescue workers had established a perimeter, set up a staging area for equipment, and begun the delicate process of figuring out exactly where the boys were trapped. The expertise of the visiting spelunkers became invaluable. Richardson and his team understood how lava tube collapses behave, which rocks were likely load-bearing, and how to shore up the pile without triggering additional falls. The first priority was locating Atkinson, who was deeper underground and completely buried. Using sound mapping, rescuers had Adams call out specific words while they listened from various points around the collapse zone. By triangulating the echoes, they could estimate roughly where Atkinson was trapped. What they discovered was both good news and bad news. Good news: Atkinson was in what appeared to be a stable pocket about 12 feet down. Bad news: reaching him would require moving several tons of rock without triggering another collapse. The rescue work itself was painstakingly slow. Each rock had to be evaluated before being moved. Rescuers used hydraulic jacks to brace larger boulders while they worked, essentially building a temporary support structure inside the collapse zone. Adams, meanwhile, was dealing with his own nightmare. He was conscious and could move his upper body, but his legs were pinned under rocks that probably weighed several hundred pounds each. The psychological stress of being trapped is something most people can't imagine. You're completely helpless, dependent on strangers working above you. Dr. Sarah Chun, the flight medic who rappelled down from the helicopter, spent most of the rescue operation talking to Adams through gaps in the rocks. Keeping him calm wasn't just about comfort. It was medical necessity. Stress can accelerate shock, and shock can kill you even if your injuries aren't immediately life-threatening. The work was brutal. Volcanic rock isn't just heavy, it's sharp. Obsidian edges can cut through work gloves like paper. Rescuers took turns because the physical demands were exhausting, and fatigue leads to mistakes that could kill everyone involved. At 12:30 p.m., they hit their first major obstacle. A boulder the size of a refrigerator was sitting directly above where they believed Atkinson was trapped. Moving it would probably clear the way to reach him, but it was also clearly helping to support several other large rocks. The team decided to use controlled displacement. They would build a framework of wooden supports around the boulder, then use hydraulic jacks to lift it just enough to slide it sideways rather than removing it entirely. The process took nearly an hour, cutting wooden braces with chainsaws while lying in cramped positions, positioning hydraulic jacks on uneven surfaces, all while knowing that two kids were trapped somewhere below. When they finally got the boulder moved, Richardson squeezed down through the gap with a headlamp and a rope. Atkinson was alive, conscious, and trapped in a pocket of air about the size of a closet. He had scrapes and bruises, but no obvious broken bones. However, he was completely enclosed. Rocks blocked every possible exit. Getting Atkinson out required another hour of careful rock removal, working in relay teams. One person would squeeze into the opening, move rocks by hand, then pass them up to someone who could carry them to the surface. It was like excavating an archaeological site, except the artifacts weighed 50 pounds each and the ceiling could fall in at any moment. At 12:55 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the collapse, Atkinson emerged into daylight. He was scraped up, dehydrated, and shaking, but he was walking. The helicopter crew had him strapped to a backboard and airborne within 10 minutes. But Adams was still trapped, and his situation was more precarious. The rocks pinning his legs had shifted during Atkinson's rescue, and the pile was becoming even more unstable. Rescuers now had to work faster, but also more carefully. The afternoon had grown hot, and heat does strange things to rock formations. Thermal expansion can shift stones that seem perfectly stable in the morning. Rescue workers were fighting fatigue and the psychological pressure of knowing that one wrong move could cost a 14-year-old his life. Adams was holding up remarkably well, considering the circumstances. He'd been trapped for nearly 4 hours, unable to move his lower body, breathing dust and listening to the constant sound of rocks grinding against each other. The final phase required the most delicate work yet. The rocks pinning Adams' legs weren't just heavy. They were wedged together in a way that made them extremely difficult to move safely. Rescuers used pneumatic airbags and manual leverage to gradually shift the weight off his legs. At 2 p.m., 4 hours after the collapse, John Adams was finally pulled free. Like Atkinson, he was conscious, alert, and incredibly lucky. His legs were bruised and probably sprained, but nothing was broken. The helicopter made its second trip of the day. The aftermath revealed just how close they'd all come to disaster. When park engineers examined the collapse site the following week, they found that the rock pile was even more unstable than anyone had realized. The chamber where Atkinson had been trapped was actually suspended above a much larger void. What saved them wasn't just luck, though luck certainly played a role. It was the fact that when crisis struck, every person involved stepped up. Kevin Smith's sprint to get help. The visiting spelunkers who dropped their vacation plans to crawl into a dangerous hole. The rescue workers who spent hours in claustrophobic conditions, moving rocks by hand. Both Atkinson and Adams made full recoveries and, somewhat surprisingly, didn't swear off caving entirely. Adams actually became quite an accomplished spelunker in his own right. Atkinson became an emergency medical technician, then a paramedic, eventually specializing in wilderness rescue operations. The Smith brothers continued exploring caves throughout their teens and into adulthood. Kevin eventually became a professional geological surveyor. Mike went into engineering, with a focus on structural stability assessment. Looking back, what strikes me most about this story isn't the dramatic rescue, though that was certainly impressive. It's the chain of small decisions that led to the crisis, and then the chain of quick, smart decisions that resolved it. Any one of those links in the chain fails, and we're talking about a very different story. Instead, it became one of those stories that park rangers tell during training sessions about the importance of preparation, quick response, and never underestimating the forces you're dealing with when you venture underground. And a reminder that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things.